The ship descended through clouds that shimmered like liquid silver, and Danny Carter pressed his face against the viewport like a child seeing snow for the first time. He had traveled across half the galaxy to reach this place, and now that he was finally here, the weight of his mission settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Volanthos Prime was everything the briefings had promised and more. Crystal spires rose from the surface like frozen lightning, catching the light of twin suns and scattering it into rainbows that danced across the landscape, and the cities below seemed to glow with an inner fire that made Earth's greatest metropolises look like primitive villages. "Beautiful, is it not?" asked Ambassador Lisa Grant, stepping up beside him with her arms crossed over her chest. Danny nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the world below. He was not here as a tourist, and he was not here as a soldier, though he had been both of those things in his 42 years of life. Today, he wore the uniform of a diplomatic attaché, a fancy title that really meant he was the person who would stand between the ambassador and any danger that might arise. The Velan Empire had invited humanity to negotiate a trade alliance, the first such invitation extended to their species since they had stumbled onto the galactic stage 3 decades ago. It was an honor, the politicians back on Earth had said, a chance to prove that humans belonged among the stars. Danny was not so sure about that. He had read the intelligence reports, had studied the Velans and their culture for months before this journey, and what he had learned did not fill him with confidence. The Velans were an ancient race, their civilization stretching back over 100,000 years, and they viewed younger species the way a grown adult might view a crawling infant. "Remember," Lisa said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "we are here to make friends, not enemies. No matter what they say, no matter how they treat us, we smile and we nod, and we remember that the future of human trade in this sector depends on our success." "I understand, Ambassador," Danny replied, though his jaw tightened at her words. The shuttle landed on a platform of polished white stone, and when the doors opened, Danny felt the alien air rush into his lungs. It was sweeter than Earth air, tinged with something that reminded him of honeysuckle and rain, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing it in. The Velan welcoming party waited at the far end of the platform, a group of tall, elegant beings with skin that seemed to shift between shades of blue and purple depending on the light. Their eyes were large and luminous, their movements graceful in a way that made humans look clumsy by comparison. And they watched the human delegation approach with expressions that Danny could only describe as polite contempt. At the center of the group stood a female Velan who could only be the princess. She was taller than the others, her skin a deep violet that darkened to near black at her fingertips, and she wore armor that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian. Her eyes, golden and slitted like a cat's, fixed on Danny the moment he stepped off the shuttle, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical pressure against his chest. "Welcome to Volanthos Prime," the princess said, her voice carrying across the platform without any apparent effort. She spoke in perfect English, though her accent gave the words a musical quality that was almost hypnotic. "I am Princess Kalindra of the Third House, and I have been tasked with overseeing your visit to our world." Ambassador Brandt stepped forward with a practiced smile, her hands clasped in front of her in the traditional Velan greeting gesture. Danny had to give her credit. She had studied hard for this moment, and her execution was flawless. "We are honored by your welcome, Princess Kalindra," Lisa said, bowing her head slightly. "The people of Earth extend their gratitude for this opportunity to build bridges between our civilizations." Kalindra's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but her eyes remained cold and assessing. She looked at the human delegation the way a scientist might look at specimens under a microscope, curious but ultimately detached. Yes, the princess said slowly, drawing out the word. We have heard much about your people. You are the ones who crawled out of your caves barely a heartbeat ago, are you not? She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. And now you wish to trade with an empire that was ancient when your ancestors were still learning to walk upright. Danny felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, but he kept his face carefully neutral. Beside him he could sense the other members of the delegation stiffening with barely concealed anger. We may be young, Lisa replied, her voice steady despite the insult, but we have much to offer. Humanity has survived challenges that would have broken lesser species, and we bring resources and technologies that could benefit both our peoples. Resources? Kaelindra laughed again, louder this time, and the other Velans joined in, their voices blending into a chorus of mockery. What could you possibly offer us that we do not already possess? Your species is weak, fragile, easily broken. I have seen the reports on your biology, and I am amazed you survived long enough to develop space travel. She stepped closer to the human delegation, her golden eyes sweeping over them with undisguised disdain. When her gaze landed on Danny, she paused, tilting her head to the side like a predator considering its prey. This one has scars, she observed, reaching out to trace a finger along the faded white line that ran across Danny's cheek. Did you earn these in battle, human, or did you simply fall down some stairs? Danny met her gaze without flinching, his voice flat and calm when he spoke. I earned every scar I carry, princess. How amusing. Kaelindra withdrew her hand and turned to address the crowd that had gathered to watch the exchange, raising her voice so that all could hear. These humans claim to be warriors, to be survivors, but I see nothing before me except soft-skinned creatures who would not last a day on our training grounds. She spun back to face the delegation, her eyes bright with challenge. I propose a test. Let one of your humans face me in the trial of endurance, the sacred test of our people. Let us see if there is any strength in your species, or if you are merely pretenders who stumbled upon the stars by accident. The other delegates exchanged nervous glances, and Danny could see the fear in their eyes. The trial of endurance was legendary throughout the galaxy, a brutal test that had killed thousands of Velan warriors over the centuries, and no outsider had ever been foolish enough to attempt it. Ambassador Grant opened her mouth to politely decline, but before she could speak, Danny stepped forward. I accept your challenge, princess, he said, his voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. Kaelindra stared at him for a long moment, her expression shifting from surprise to amusement to something that looked almost like pity. She shook her head slowly and laughed. You have no idea what you have agreed to, human. She leaned in close, so close that Danny could feel the heat radiating from her skin, and whispered in a voice dripping with contempt, You will not last a minute, human. Danny smiled, a thin, cold expression that did not reach his eyes. We shall see, princess. We shall see. The quarters assigned to the human delegation were comfortable enough, with soft beds and flowing water, and windows that looked out over the crystal city. But Danny could find no peace within their walls. He stood at the window as the twin suns sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. And he thought about what he had done. The door behind him slid open, and he did not need to turn around to know who had entered. Ambassador Grant's footsteps were quick and sharp, the sound of a woman who was barely containing her fury. Have you completely lost your mind? Lisa demanded, her voice tight with anger. Do you have any idea what you have done? The trial of endurance has killed Velan warriors, Danny, beings who are stronger and faster and more resilient than any human has ever been. Danny continued to stare out the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "I know exactly what I have done, Ambassador." "Then explain it to me." Lisa crossed the room and grabbed his arm, forcing him to turn and face her. "Explain to me why you just volunteered to die on an alien world. Explain to me how I am supposed to tell Earth Command that I let one of my people commit suicide by alien death trial." "It was not suicide," Danny said quietly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "It was the only choice that made sense." Lisa released his arm and stepped back, her expression shifting from anger to confusion. "What are you talking about?" Danny moved to one of the chairs and sat down heavily, suddenly feeling every one of his 42 years. He rubbed his hands together, studying the scars that crisscrossed his palms and knuckles, and began to speak. "The Valens are a warrior culture," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "Everything in their society is built around strength, around the idea that the powerful deserve to rule, and the weak deserve to serve. They invited us here not because they respect us, but because they wanted to see what we are made of." He looked up at Lisa, his eyes hard. "If we had refused the challenge, if we had backed down in front of all those witnesses, the Valens would have marked humanity as prey. Every trade negotiation, every diplomatic meeting, every interaction with their empire would have been colored by that moment of weakness." "So you decided to get yourself killed instead?" Lisa asked, her voice heavy with frustration. "I decided to show them what a human can do," Danny replied. "Whether I win or lose, whether I live or die, I will show them that we are not the soft, fragile creatures they believe us to be." Lisa sat down across from him, her anger fading into something that looked almost like fear. "Danny, I have read your file. I know about your service record, but this is different. The Velens have been perfecting their bodies for 100,000 years. You cannot possibly compete with that." Danny smiled, a thin and humorless expression. "Let me tell you a story, Ambassador. 8 years ago, I was captured by the Korthax on a planet called Meridian 7. They held me for 4 years in a prison camp designed to break human soldiers, and every day they told me I would not survive another night." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a network of scars that covered his arm like a twisted road map. "They burned me, they cut me, they froze me and starved me, and did things that I still cannot speak about. They killed everyone else in my unit, one by one, and they made me watch." Lisa's face had gone pale, but Danny continued, his voice steady and calm. "After 4 years I escaped. I walked 200 miles through hostile territory with a broken leg and 3 cracked ribs, eating insects and drinking rainwater. And when I finally reached the extraction point, the rescue team could not believe I was still alive." He met the ambassador's eyes. "The doctors said I should have died a dozen times over. They said no human being could survive what I had been through. But I did survive, because that is what humans do." Danny stood and walked back to the window, his reflection staring back at him with eyes that had seen too much. "The Velens think they understand pain. They think they understand endurance. But they have never met someone who refused to die simply because the universe said he should." Before Lisa could respond, a chime sounded at the door, and Danny called out for the visitor to enter. The door slid open to reveal a young Velen male, his skin a lighter shade of blue than the princess, and his eyes filled with something that looked almost like respect. "I am Prince Theron," the young Velen said, stepping into the room with a grace that seemed almost liquid. "I am the younger brother of Princess Kaelindra, and I have come to speak with the human who accepted my sister's challenge." Danny inclined his head in greeting. "I am Danny Carter. What can I do for you, Prince Theron?" The prince moved to stand beside Danny at the window, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky. "I came to warn you," he said quietly. "My sister is the greatest warrior of her generation. She has never been defeated in the trial of endurance, and she has killed 3 challengers who dared to face her." "I appreciate the warning," Danny replied. but I will not withdraw. Theron turned to study the human with those large, luminous eyes. I watched you today, when my sister mocked your people and challenged your honor. I saw the scars on your hands, the way you carry yourself, the stillness in your eyes. You are not like the other humans I have met. I have simply lived a different life, Danny said. Perhaps. Theron was quiet for a moment, then spoke again in a voice barely above a whisper. There is something you should know. The trial of endurance is not merely a test of physical strength. It is designed to break the mind as well as the body. Many warriors have passed the physical stages only to shatter during the psychological trials. Danny nodded slowly. I suspected as much. And yet you still accepted? Theron asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Pain and fear are old friends of mine, Danny replied, his gaze distant. We have an understanding. The prince studied him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He bowed, a deep and formal gesture of respect that seemed out of place given the circumstances. I hope you survive, human. It has been a long time since anyone surprised my sister, and I believe you may be the one to do so. With that, Prince Theron turned and left, the door sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss. Ambassador Grant rose from her chair and joined Danny at the window, her earlier anger replaced by something that looked almost like hope. Do you really think you can do this? She asked softly. Danny watched the last light of the suns disappear below the horizon, plunging the crystal city into a darkness broken only by the glow of 1,000 artificial lights. I do not know if I can win, he admitted, but I know that I will not give up, and when it is over, the Velans will never again dismiss humanity as weak. Lisa placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that said more than words ever could. Then I will be there watching, cheering you on every step of the way. Danny smiled, a genuine expression this time. That is all I ask, Ambassador. That is all I ask. 3 days passed like water through open fingers, and on the morning of the trial, Danny woke before the suns rose over the crystal spires of Volanthos Prime. He dressed in the simple clothing the Velans had provided, a loose tunic and pants made from some material that felt like silk but was stronger than steel. And he ate a small breakfast of protein bars he had brought from Earth. The arena where the trial of endurance would take place was the largest structure Danny had ever seen. A massive coliseum of white stone and gleaming metal that could hold over 100,000 spectators. When he arrived, escorted by a pair of silent Velan guards, the seats were already filled to capacity, and the roar of the crowd washed over him like a physical wave. Princess Kalindra stood at the center of the arena, her dark violet skin glistening in the morning light, and she watched Danny approach with a smile that held no warmth. Beside her stood an ancient Velan male with silver skin and eyes like pools of liquid mercury, the High Arbiter who would oversee the trial and ensure that all rules were followed. You came, Kalindra said, as Danny took his place across from her. I confess, I half expected you to flee in the night, like the coward I know you to be. Danny said nothing, merely met her gaze and waited. The High Arbiter raised his hands, and the crowd fell silent with a speed that spoke of deep respect and absolute obedience. His voice echoed across the arena, amplified by technology that seemed almost magical to human ears. The trial of endurance consists of 5 stages, the Arbiter intoned: pain tolerance, environmental exposure, combat stamina, psychological pressure, and the final ascent of Mount Seraphon. To pass each stage, the challengers must endure without surrender, without collapse, and without death. The first to complete all 5 stages, or the last one standing, shall be declared the victor. He turned to look at Danny, and there was something almost like pity in those ancient eyes. Does the human challenger understand the rules and accept the consequences of failure? I understand, Danny replied, his voice steady. And I accept. Then let the trial begin. The first stage took place on a raised platform at the center of the arena, where two chairs stood facing the crowd. Danny and Kaylindra took their seats, and metal restraints clicked into place around their wrists and ankles. Electrodes were attached to their temples, their chests, and the palms of their hands. The pain tolerance test will begin at level 1 and increase every minute, the Arbiter explained. The challenger who surrenders, loses consciousness, or shows visible signs of mental breakdown will be eliminated from this stage. Danny closed his eyes and focused on his breathing, drawing on techniques he had learned during his years of captivity. The first shock came without warning, a jolt of electricity that raced through his nervous system like liquid fire, and he heard a gasp ripple through the crowd. The pain was intense, worse than anything he had experienced during training. But it was not worse than what the Korthax had done to him. Nothing would ever be worse than that. He kept his eyes closed, kept his breathing steady, and let the pain wash over him like a wave crashing against a rock. Level 2 came, and the electricity doubled in intensity. Danny's muscles spazzed. His teeth clenched so hard he thought they might crack, but he did not scream. He did not beg. He simply endured. Across from him, Kaylindra sat in perfect stillness, her face betraying no emotion. She had been born for this, trained for this from the moment she could walk, and pain was merely an old adversary she had conquered long ago. Level 3, then 4, then 5, the minutes stretched into an eternity of agony, and Danny felt his consciousness beginning to fray at the edges. He thought of his fallen comrades, the men and women who had died on Meridian 7, and he drew strength from their memory. He would not dishonor them by failing here. When level 10 arrived, several Valens in the crowd began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This was the level at which most challengers broke, the point where the pain became so intense that the body simply shut down to protect itself. Danny opened his eyes and stared directly at Kaylindra, a thin smile crossing his cracked lips. Sweat poured down his face, his body trembled with barely contained agony, but his eyes remained clear and focused. The princess returned his gaze, and for the first time, Danny saw something flicker in those golden eyes. It was not respect, not yet, but it was no longer pure contempt either. The pain tolerance test ended at level 12, with both challengers still conscious, and neither having surrendered. The restraints clicked open, and Danny rose on shaking legs, refusing the help offered by the arena attendants. Impressive, Kaylindra admitted as she stood, rolling her shoulders to work out the residual tension. Perhaps you are not entirely without merit. We are just getting started, Princess, Danny replied. The second stage took place in a chamber beneath the arena, a room that could simulate any environment the Arbiter chose. First came the heat, a blazing inferno that would have killed an unprotected human in minutes. Danny felt his skin begin to blister, felt his lungs burn with every breath, but he kept moving, kept walking, refusing to fall. Kaylindra moved through the flames like a creature born of fire. Her body adapted to temperatures that would melt steel, but she watched Danny with growing interest. By all rights, he should have collapsed by now, should have been screaming for mercy. But instead, he walked beside her, step for step, his face twisted with pain, but his spirit unbroken. Then came the cold, a frozen wasteland that would have turned human blood to ice. Danny felt his extremities going numb, felt the creeping paralysis of hypothermia beginning to set in. But he remembered the frozen wastelands of Meridian 7, the endless nights when he had been certain he would not see another dawn. He had survived then, and he would survive now. The second stage ended with both challengers still standing, and the crowd had fallen eerily quiet. They had expected the human to fail long before this point, had expected to watch him crumble and beg for mercy. But instead, They were witnessing something unprecedented. The third stage was combat stamina, a continuous sparring session against trained Velen warriors. Danny and Kaelindra would each face a rotating series of opponents, and the one who lasted longer would win the stage. Kaelindra went first, and she was magnificent. She moved like water, like wind, her strikes precise and devastating, and she defeated warrior after warrior without showing any signs of fatigue. After 2 hours, the arbiter called an end to her session, and she stood in the center of the arena with her arms raised in triumph. Then it was Danny's turn. The first warrior came at him fast and hard, expecting an easy victory. Danny ducked under a sweeping kick, drove his elbow into the Velen's ribs, and followed with a knee strike that sent his opponent crashing to the ground. The crowd gasped in surprise. The second warrior was more cautious, circling Danny like a predator, assessing its prey. They exchanged a flurry of blows, neither gaining a clear advantage, until Danny feinted left and struck right, his fist connecting with the Velen's temple and dropping him like a stone. Warrior after warrior fell, and Danny kept fighting. His movements were not graceful like the Velen's, not elegant or beautiful, but they were efficient and brutal and absolutely relentless. When one technique failed, he adapted, he improvised, he found another way. 2 hours passed, then 3, and still Danny fought. His knuckles were split and bleeding, his body covered in bruises, but he would not stop, would not surrender, would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him fall. When the arbiter finally called an end to the session, Danny stood alone in the center of the arena, surrounded by the unconscious forms of 7 Velen warriors. He looked up at Princess Kaelindra, his chest heaving with exhaustion, and smiled. The crowd rose to their feet, and for the first time, the sound that filled the arena was not mockery or contempt. It was something that sounded almost like respect. The fourth stage was the one Danny had been dreading since the moment he accepted the challenge. The psychological pressure test was legendary throughout the galaxy, a trial that had broken the minds of warriors who had passed every physical challenge without flinching. It used advanced technology to reach into the deepest corners of a person's psyche, dragging their worst fears and darkest memories into the light. The isolation chambers stood at the far end of the arena, 2 pods of black metal that seemed to absorb the light around them. Danny approached his chamber slowly, aware of the thousands of eyes watching his every move, and he paused at the entrance to take one final breath of free air. Princess Kaelindra had already entered her chamber, her face calm and composed as the door sealed behind her. She had done this before, had faced her demons and emerged victorious, and she had no doubt that she would do so again. Danny stepped into the darkness, and the door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid being lowered into place. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and shadow. Then the chamber hummed to life, and Danny felt tendrils of energy reaching into his mind, probing his memories, searching for the wounds that had never fully healed. The first vision came without warning. He was back on Meridian 7, standing in the prison camp where he had spent 4 years of his life, and the Korthax guards were dragging Sergeant Maria Reyes toward the execution post. She was the last surviving member of his squad, the woman who had kept him sane during the darkest days of his captivity, and he was powerless to save her. "Danny," Maria called out, her voice echoing across the years, "do not let them win. Do not let them break you." The Korthax commander raised his weapon, and Danny tried to move, tried to intervene, but his feet were rooted to the ground. He screamed as the energy bolt struck Maria in the chest, screamed until his throat was raw, and then he was somewhere else. He stood in a hospital room on Earth, watching his mother die of the cancer that had been slowly consuming her body for 3 years. He had been deployed when she passed, had not been there to hold her hand or tell her he loved her one last time, and the guilt had never faded. "I waited for you," his mother whispered, her eyes clouded with pain and medication. "Why did you not come?" Danny felt tears streaming down his face, felt the old wounds tearing open like fresh cuts, but he did not look away. He had spent years running from these memories, years trying to bury them beneath duty and discipline, but now he faced them head-on. The visions kept coming, faster and more intense. He relived every failure, every loss, every moment of weakness and doubt that had haunted him throughout his life. He saw the faces of friends he had failed to protect, heard the voices of enemies who had taunted him with his inadequacy, felt the crushing weight of every mistake he had ever made. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. It could have been minutes or hours or days, and Danny would not have known the difference. He sat in the center of the chamber, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with suppressed sobs, and he did not try to fight the pain. Instead, he accepted it. He accepted that he had failed people he loved, accepted that he carried scars that would never fully heal, accepted that he was flawed and broken in ways that could never be completely fixed. But he also accepted that he was still here, still fighting, still refusing to give up. The darkness of the chamber began to fade, and Danny realized that the test was ending. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, took a deep breath, and stood on trembling legs. When the door opened and the light flooded in, he stepped out into the arena and faced the crowd with his head held high. His face was wet with tears, his eyes red and swollen, but his gaze was steady and his voice was clear. "What is next?" he asked. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound of disbelief and wonder. The Velen technicians stared at their instruments, checking and rechecking the readings, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. "That is impossible," one of them whispered to the Arbiter. The chamber was operating at maximum intensity. No being should be able to endure that level of psychological trauma for 3 hours without suffering permanent damage. The Arbiter studied Danny with those ancient, knowing eyes, and something shifted in his expression. It was not pity anymore, not skepticism, but something that looked almost like awe. Princess Kaelindra emerged from her own chamber a few minutes later, her composure intact, but her eyes haunted by whatever visions she had faced. She saw Danny standing in the center of the arena, surrounded by confused technicians and stunned spectators, and she stopped dead in her tracks. "You survived," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did," Danny replied simply. Kaelindra walked toward him slowly, her movements lacking the fluid grace they had displayed earlier. The psychological trial had taken something from her as well, and she studied the human with new eyes. "What did you see in there?" she asked, genuine curiosity replacing her earlier contempt. Danny was silent for a long moment, then spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the arena. "I saw everyone I have ever lost. I saw every mistake I have ever made. I saw the darkness that lives inside me, the broken pieces that I have spent my whole life trying to hide." He met Kaelindra's gaze, and his eyes held no shame, no weakness, only a terrible, beautiful strength. "And I survived, because that is what humans do. We do not pretend to be unbreakable. We acknowledge our cracks and our scars and our failures, and then we get up and keep moving forward." Prince Theron had descended from the royal viewing platform to stand at the edge of the arena, and he approached his sister with worry etched across his features. He placed a hand on her shoulder and spoke quietly, but his words carried in the hushed silence. "I told you not to underestimate him, sister." Kaelindra shook off her brother's hand, her expression hardening with renewed determination. "The trial is not over yet. There is still the final stage, the climb up Mount Seraphim. That is where this ends." The Arbiter stepped forward, his voice booming across the arena. "The fourth stage is complete. Both challengers have passed. The fifth and final stage will begin at dawn tomorrow. The first to reach the summit of Mount Sarathin will be declared the victor of the trial of endurance. Danny looked toward the distant horizon, where the frozen peak of Mount Sarathin rose against the darkening sky like a blade of ice, piercing the heavens. It was beautiful and terrible, a mountain that had killed hundreds of Velen warriors over the centuries, and tomorrow he would climb it. Ambassador Lisa Grant pushed her way through the crowd and wrapped Danny in a fierce embrace, not caring about protocol or appearances. "You did it," she whispered. "You made it through." Danny hugged her back, drawing strength from her warmth. "The hardest part is still ahead," he said quietly, "but I am ready." As he turned to leave the arena, he caught Princess Kaelindra watching him with an expression he could not quite read. It was not hatred, not anymore, but it was not friendship either. It was something in between, something that might have been the first stirrings of respect. Tomorrow would decide everything. Tomorrow, on the frozen slopes of Mount Sarathin, the fate of humanity's place among the stars would be determined. Danny smiled and walked into the fading light, his body broken, but his spirit burning brighter than ever before. Mount Sarathin rose before them like a frozen giant, its peak lost in clouds that swirled with winds strong enough to tear the flesh from bone. Danny stood at the base of the mountain as the first light of dawn painted the ice in shades of pink and gold, and he felt the cold seeping into his very soul. Princess Kaelindra stood a few feet away, her violet skin darkening to near black in the frigid air, her golden eyes fixed on the path ahead. She wore the traditional climbing gear of the Velen warriors, minimal protection designed to test endurance rather than ensure survival, and Danny wore the same. The Arbiter's voice crackled through the communication devices embedded in their ears. "The rules are simple. Climb to the summit. The first to reach the top is declared the victor. There are no restrictions on methods, no penalties for aggression. This is the final test, and only strength and will shall determine the outcome." Danny looked at Kaelindra, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them in that moment. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement of shared struggle, a recognition that they were both warriors facing the same mountain. "May the strongest prevail," Kaelindra said, her breath forming clouds of mist in the frozen air. "May the strongest prevail," Danny echoed. The horn sounded, and they began to climb. Kaelindra was faster from the start. Her body adapted to environments that would kill a human in minutes. She moved up the frozen rocks with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, finding handholds and footholds that Danny could barely see, and within the first hour she had pulled significantly ahead. Danny did not try to match her pace. He knew his limits, knew that if he burned himself out in the early stages, he would never make it to the top. Instead, he settled into a steady rhythm, conserving his energy while making consistent progress up the unforgiving slope. The wind began to howl around the 2-hour mark, blasting them with ice crystals that felt like needles against exposed skin. Danny pulled his hood tighter and kept climbing, his hands numb and bleeding, his lungs burning with every breath of thin mountain air. Through the communication device, he could hear commentary from the arena below, broadcasters describing the climb to billions of viewers across the galaxy. They spoke of Kaelindra's commanding lead, of the humans' futile struggle, of how remarkable it was that he had made it this far, but how inevitable his failure had become. Danny blocked out their voices and focused on the next handhold, the next foothold, the next breath. He had stopped feeling his fingers hours ago, had stopped feeling his feet not long after, but he kept moving forward, kept refusing to quit. The halfway point came and went, marked by a frozen stone pillar that had stood on the mountain for 10,000 years. Kaelindra was nearly an hour ahead of him now, a distant figure against the white expanse of ice and snow, and Danny knew that he could not catch her. But catching her was not the point. It had never been the point. He climbed because stopping was not an option. He climbed because somewhere below, Ambassador Grant was watching, believing in him. He climbed because across the galaxy, humans were watching, hoping that one of their own could prove they belonged among the stars. He climbed because his fallen comrades deserved a legacy of courage rather than surrender. The temperature dropped as he ascended, plunging to levels that should have been fatal. Danny felt the frostbite setting into his extremities, felt his body beginning to shut down in a desperate attempt to preserve core functions. But he did not stop. One hand in front of the other, one foot above the last. Breathe, move, survive, repeat. He did not know how many hours had passed when he finally saw the summit through the swirling snow. It was close now, close enough that he could almost reach out and touch it, and standing at the top was Princess Kalindra, her silhouette dark against the pale sky. She had won. The trial of endurance was over, but Danny kept climbing. His hands were destroyed, bleeding through makeshift bandages of torn cloth, leaving crimson stains on the white ice. His lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to stop, to give up, to let the mountain claim him as it had claimed so many others. He kept climbing. The broadcast cameras captured every moment, transmitting his struggle to billions of viewers who watched in stunned silence. This was not what they had expected, not what anyone had expected. The human should have collapsed long ago, should have given up when victory became impossible. But instead, he climbed. When Danny finally pulled himself over the last ledge and collapsed onto the frozen stone of the summit, he could not feel his body anymore. He lay there gasping, staring up at the alien sky, and he waited for the darkness to take him. Instead, Princess Kalindra knelt beside him, her golden eyes wide with an emotion he had never seen from her before. She said nothing for a long moment, simply staring at this impossible human who had refused to accept defeat. "You were supposed to break," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Danny smiled through cracked and bleeding lips, his voice a ragged whisper that somehow carried the weight of everything humanity had ever endured. "Humans do not break, Your Highness. We bend, and then we get back up." Kalindra reached down and helped him sit up, supporting his broken body with surprising gentleness. She looked out at the view from the summit, at the crystal cities and silver clouds far below, and then she looked back at Danny. "I have met thousands of warriors from dozens of species," she said slowly. "I have faced the greatest champions the galaxy has to offer, and I have defeated them all. But I have never, in all my years, encountered anyone like you." She stood and turned to face the cameras, raising her voice so that all could hear. "This human did not win the trial of endurance, but he has won something far greater. He has won my respect and the respect of every Velan who witnessed his courage." Far below, in the arena, the crowd rose to their feet. One by one, they began to bow, a gesture of honor that had never before been extended to an outsider. The sound of their movement rippled outward like a wave, spreading through the cities and across the planet as billions of Velans acknowledged what they had witnessed. Prince Theron stood beside Ambassador Grant, and both of them had tears in their eyes. Lisa clutched her hands together and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever gods might be listening. On the summit of Mount Seraphim, Princess Kalindra extended her hand to Danny Carter, and he took it, allowing her to help him rise on legs that could barely support his weight. They stood together, two warriors from different worlds, and something fundamental shifted in the relationship between their peoples. "The trade alliance will be signed immediately," Kalindra said, her voice carrying across the mountain. "And let it be known throughout the galaxy that humanity has proven themselves worthy of standing among the great civilizations of the stars." Danny looked at her, exhaustion and triumph mingling in his eyes. "All I did was refuse to give up," he said. Kaelindra smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face from cold beauty to something warm and almost human. "That is exactly what makes your species so terrifying, Danny Carter. You never ever quit." The rescue shuttle arrived an hour later, and as Danny was carried aboard, he looked back at the frozen peak where everything had changed. The mountain stood silent and eternal, a testament to the trial he had endured, and he knew that his name would be remembered here for generations to come. Humans had arrived among the stars, and they were here to stay. The galaxy would never underestimate them again.